The morning peace of Cedar Ridge shattered with a sound no suburban street should ever hear, the chopping thunder of rotor blades. Curtains flew open, coffee mugs froze mid-sip, and neighbors stumbled barefoot onto their lawns. Phones went up in unison, as if the whole block knew instinctively this was history in the making. And there, in the center of it all, stood Karen Kensington, the self-anointed queen of our HOA, screaming in disbelief as chains clinked around her pristine white Lexus, the very car she had parked across my garage to teach me a clan lesson. What happened next turned a petty HOA feud into a viral spectacle that rocked our community, humiliated a mayor, and changed the balance of power in our neighborhood forever. Before we dive into this insane story, I've got one request for you. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing just how far these HOA tales travel across the world. I used to believe that Cedar Ridge was the kind of place where you could come home from work, park your truck in peace, and maybe sip a cold beer on the porch without someone breathing down your neck. For 12 years, I held on to that illusion. Kids rode bikes in the cul-de-sac, old Mr. Jenkins watered his tomato plants, and my roses bloomed like clockwork every spring. But the day Karen Kensington moved in, everything shifted. It was as if the air itself grew heavier. Karen wasn't just another neighbor. She was a force of nature, or maybe more accurately, a storm. She arrived with a clipboard clutched in one hand and a permanent sneer etched into her face, immediately proclaiming herself the savior of community standards. Within a week, she had measured hedges, issued violation slips, and yelled at children for chalk drawings on the sidewalk. The HOA loved her at first, finally someone willing to enforce the rules. But it didn't take long for people to see the crown she wore wasn't for leadership, it was for tyranny. My first run-in with her wasn't even about something major. It was about my roses. Those roses had been growing in front of my house long before the HOA charter was even written. My wife used to tend them before she passed, and I kept them as a living memory of her. To me, they weren't just flowers, they were family. Karen saw them differently. She marched up, ruler in hand, and declared them untamed, non-compliant with aesthetic codes. She slapped me with a violation notice, as if she were a sheriff handing out speeding tickets. "Rules are rules," she told me, wagging her finger like a schoolteacher. "Karen," I said as calmly as I could, "those roses have been here longer than this HOA has existed. They're not coming down." Her smile was the kind that could curdle milk. "Then we'll see about enforcement." From that moment forward, I became her personal project. Every time she walked by, I could feel her eyes on my house, hunting for some flaw. Trash can left out 5 minutes too long. Notice. My nephew's pickup truck parked overnight. Notice. I lived in a constant state of siege, but I never bowed. I figured, what's the worst she could do? I was wrong. That fateful Tuesday morning, I stepped out of my front door with a fresh cup of coffee and froze. There, gleaming in the sunlight, was Karen's white Lexus SUV parked sideways across my driveway. Not at the curb, not in the street, no. She had nosed it directly across both my garage doors, blocking me completely. I blinked, thinking maybe she had lost control. But then I saw it, a neatly folded piece of paper, tucked under my windshield wiper. In bold black letters it read, "Perhaps this will remind you that no one is above HOA compliance. Trim the roses, or next time I'll have your car booted. HOA President Karen." I nearly spat my coffee onto her hood. This woman had decided to block my property over flowers. Flowers. My hands trembled not from fear, but from fury. I pulled out my phone and called the police. Surely I thought this was illegal. But when the officer answered and I explained the situation, he chuckled. "Sorry, sir. That sounds like a civil matter. Nothing we can do unless there's a city code violation." "Civil matter?" I repeated, my voice tight. "Yes, sir. You'll need to resolve it with your HOA." I hung up stunned. In other words, Karen had me cornered. By mid-morning, the entire cul-de-sac had gathered. Some pretended to walk their dogs, others just stood on their lawns, sipping coffee, eager for the drama. Teenagers balanced on their bikes, filming like amateur reporters. I could hear them whispering, "He's not going to let that slide. She's gone too far this time." I stepped out calmly, coffee still in hand, and raised my voice. "Karen, would you mind moving your tank off my driveway?" Her front door burst open. Out she marched, designer sunglasses, perched on her nose, hair sprayed, stiff like a helmet, and that cursed clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Excuse me," she snapped. "This is a lawful immobilization of property. You have repeatedly refused to comply with HOA standards. Until you do, your access is revoked." I stared at her, stunned. "Revoked, Karen. This is my driveway. My garage. My property." She smirked like a villain who thought she'd won the final battle. You signed the covenant when you moved in. The HOA has every right to enforce compliance. The crowd murmured some stifling laughter at her theatrics, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Karen, of course, wasn't joking. She believed every word. I gently set my coffee cup on the hood of her Lexus. She gasped like I'd committed sacrilege. Move it, I said, voice calm, but steady, or I'll have it towed. Her lips curled into a grin. Go ahead. I already called the towing company. They're under contract with us. They won't touch my car. And with that, she turned on her heel and strutted back inside. The neighbors buzzed like bees. One whispered, he's done for. Another muttered, she's finally lost it. Phones kept recording. The circus was in full swing. I looked at the Lexus gleaming in the sun, a smug blockade standing between me and my freedom. It wasn't just a car, it was a monument to her arrogance. And in that moment, the weight of it all hit me. This wasn't about roses. This wasn't even about compliance. This was about power. Karen wanted to humiliate me to make an example of me, and she thought she'd won. But here's the thing about me, I don't break. And when I do bend, I don't just snap back, I build. Plans, schemes, blueprints for poetic justice. That evening, as the sun set and Karen's Lexus still blocked my garage, I knew what I had to do. She had turned this into a public spectacle. Fine. I would answer in kind, except my answer wouldn't be petty. It would be unforgettable. Because if Karen wanted to show the neighborhood her power, I was about to show her what happens when the wrong man decides to play. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach and a Lexus still parked across my garage. For a second, I thought maybe it had all been a dream. But no, the sunlight hit the chrome just right, blinding me, as if Karen wanted to remind me before I even sipped my coffee that she was in charge. The note she left under my wiper was now fluttering against the breeze like a victory flag. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and dove headfirst into research. I needed to know my rights. I combed through the city ordinances, state property codes, and even HOA bylaws that Karen loved to twist in her favor. And sure enough, there it was, in black and white. Blocking someone's driveway wasn't just rude, it was trespassing. But the law is funny. It always seems to bend around people like Karen. I called 3 different towing companies that morning, each one giving me the same rehearsed line. Sorry, sir, we're under contract with the Cedar Ridge HOA. We can't touch vehicles that belong to the board. Translation: Karen had them all locked down months ago. Frustration simmered in my chest. She'd built herself a fortress of rules and contracts thinking she was untouchable. And the worst part, the police weren't going to help. The HOA board wasn't going to help. I was on my own. Later that day, I stepped outside. The cul-de-sac was buzzing again. Teenagers perched on their bikes like vultures, recording every second for their TikToks. Old Mr. Jenkins shuffled down the sidewalk, shaking his head. Son, he said, lowering his voice, I've lived here 30 years. Nobody ever stood up to that woman and came out clean. He leaned in, his eyes sharp, despite the wrinkles. But you, I think you might be the one. I gave him a tight smile. Don't worry, Mr. Jenkins. I've got a plan. Truth was, the plan wasn't clear yet. But as I stared at Karen's Lexus glinting in the sun, mocking me, an idea began to form. It wasn't about brute force. It wasn't about slashing tires or sneaking around at night like some vandal. No, this had to be bigger, cleaner, and above all, public. If Karen wanted a spectacle, I was going to give her one she'd never forget. That evening, I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon, scrolling through contacts on my phone. And then I saw a name I hadn't thought about in years: Rodrigo Roeder Alvarez. Back in my contracting days, Roeder and I had worked side by side on heavy lift projects, moving steel beams, shipping containers, even a derailed train car once. These days, he ran a helicopter lifting service out by the industrial yards. My heart started pounding as the vision crystallized. Karen thought she was clever, parking her Lexus across my driveway. But what if that same Lexus ended up somewhere very public, somewhere symbolic I called Roeder? His voice was the same, gravelly and excited, like a kid who loved machines more than people. Roeder, you still running that heavy lift service, you know it, he said. What do you need? Move steel beams, concrete blocks. I paused, savoring the words. A car. There was silence, then laughter. A car. My Birds Hall steel man, not Toyotas. It's not a Toyota, I said. It's a Lexus. And it's parked illegally across my garage. The laughter stopped cold. Illegally? Yep. I've got photos, witnesses, everything. I just need it relocated. I swear I could hear his grin through the phone. Send me the address. I'll make it happen. The next step was legal cover. Karen was queen of lawsuits, and the last thing I wanted was to hand her ammunition. So I called up my buddy Travis, a lawyer who owed me a favor. Over beers at the pub, I laid out the scenario without naming names. If someone parks their car across your driveway, can you move it? I asked. Travis smirked. Technically, yeah, it's trespass. Property owners can remove trespassing vehicles by reasonable means. I raised an eyebrow. Would a helicopter count as reasonable? He nearly choked on his beer. Depends where you drop it. Don't put it on the freeway, and you're probably fine. I leaned back, my mind spinning. What about a lawn? As long as you've got permission, he said, shrugging. It's your circus. Permission. That word stuck in my head, because I knew exactly whose lawn I wanted to use, Mayor Grant Ellison's. He was Karen's biggest enabler, her golf buddy, her political shield. She donated to his campaigns, and he looked the other way while she ran Cedar Ridge like her personal fiefdom. If I wanted to make a statement, dropping Karen's Lexus right on his manicured lawn would be perfect symmetry. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at my kitchen table maps, spread out a notebook filled with calculations. Weight distribution, rotor capacity, rigging points, it had to be flawless. I wasn't just planning a prank. I was planning a surgical strike, one that would dismantle Karen's smug little empire in one fell swoop. By Thursday, word had spread around the neighborhood. Not about the helicopter, no, that part I kept tight. But people could sense something was coming. Neighbors whispered on sidewalks. Kids lingered by my yard longer than usual, their eyes wide with anticipation. Even Jenkins gave me a sly wink like he knew I was cooking up something legendary. Meanwhile, Karen strutted around like a queen, basking in the attention. She threw an impromptu HOA seminar right in front of her Lexus clipboard in hand, lecturing neighbors about recycling bins and hedge heights. Every few minutes, she made sure to glance in my direction, sunglasses glinting as if daring me to react. I didn't take the bait. I just smiled, watered my roses, and waved politely. Let her think she'd won. The higher she climbed on her tower of arrogance, the harder she'd fall. Friday evening, Rotor texted me, birds ready, chains and rigging gear prepped, weather looks clear. Saturday, 9 a.m., I stared at the message for a long time, then typed back, perfect. Let's give this neighborhood a show they'll never forget. The pieces were in place. The evidence was airtight. The stage was set. And as the sun dipped low that night, casting long shadows across my blocked driveway, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Calm. Karen thought she'd beaten me, but she was about to learn the most important lesson of her life. Never start a war with a man who knows how to fly. Saturday morning crept up faster than I expected. The night before, I barely slept. My mind replayed every detail, every calculation of weight ratios, every safety check Rotor had insisted on, every angle from which the neighbors might record. I knew I was about to do something outrageous, maybe even reckless, but it wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the entire neighborhood that had been held hostage by one woman and her clipboard. I stepped onto the porch at dawn, coffee steaming in my hand. The Lexus still sat smugly across my driveway, dew glistening on its windshield like jewels. For 5 straight days, it had been a monument to Karen's arrogance. Kids rode their bikes around it as if it were some kind of suburban Stonehenge. Joggers slowed their pace to snap photos. Even the mailman cracked a grin every time he shoved envelopes into my box. At 8:15, Karen made her grand entrance. She strutted out in a neon pink tracksuit, her sunglasses reflecting the morning sun like a pair of polished daggers. Clipboard in hand, she called an impromptu HOA sermon right there on her front lawn. She barked about recycling bins not being color-coded, trash cans not being rolled in fast enough, and of course, unsightly landscaping. At one point, she jabbed her pen at me, and some residents still refused to comply, she announced loudly, her voice slicing through the crisp morning air. Rest assured, the HOA board has ways of enforcing order. A few neighbors rolled their eyes. Others filmed her rant, trying not to laugh. She mistook their silence for obedience, standing tall like a general preparing her troops. I simply watered my roses, humming an old tune, pretending not to notice her theatrics. Inside, though, I was checking my watch. 8:52. Time to move. I slipped inside my house and pulled out my phone. One quick call to Rotor was all it took. His voice buzzed with energy on the other end. We're good to go. Chains locked, birds warmed. ETA 3 minutes. Copy that, I said, my pulse quickening. Make it memorable. I returned to my porch, acting as casual as I could. The air seemed heavier, somehow charged with anticipation. Then it started, the faint thump, thump, thump of rotor blades on the horizon. At first, only I noticed. But then dogs barked, heads turned, coffee mugs froze mid-sip. A murmur rippled through the crowd gathering along the sidewalks. Karen shaded her eyes, frowning. What on earth? The sound grew louder, closer, until even the most oblivious neighbor realized something big was coming. And then, cresting above the tree line, a massive heavy-lift helicopter roared into view. Sunlight flashed off its windows, the downdraft whipping branches and scattering newspapers down the street. Gasps erupted. Phones shot up like an army of antennas. Someone shouted, "Oh my God, is that a helicopter?" Karen's frown twisted into fury. "This is a residential neighborhood," she screeched. "Who authorized this?" She didn't have to wait long for an answer. The helicopter lowered directly over my driveway blades, chopping the air like a war drum. The wind knocked over lawn chairs, sent hats flying, and nearly ripped the clipboard from Karen's hands. And then, like something straight out of an action movie, Rotor's rigging team rappelled down, chains clinking. Karen shrieked, her voice cracking. "Stop. That's my car. I'm the HOA president. I demand you stop." But her orders were drowned out by the roar of the rotors. In less than a minute, the riggers had looped thick industrial-grade chains around the Lexus's frame, securing them with military precision. The SUV rocked gently as the helicopter began to lift. Tires squealed against the pavement before leaving the ground altogether. Up it went, dangling helplessly 10 feet above the asphalt. The crowd erupted into cheers and laughter. Jenkins, bless his old soul, shouted at the top of his lungs. "It's happening. He's doing it." Karen fell to her knees in the middle of the cul-de-sac, arms outstretched like a mother watching her child being taken away. Her hair whipped wildly around her face, her sunglasses askew. She screamed every threat she could think of, lawsuits, police, city hall, but nobody cared. The noise swallowed her voice, and the sight of her precious Lexus floating in the sky burned itself into everyone's memory. I stood there calm as a monk, coffee cup in hand, my robe flapping in the wind. Neighbors turned their cameras on me, some laughing, others shaking their heads in disbelief. I didn't need to say anything. The image spoke louder than words. Karen's reign of terror was airborne, and I was the one who sent it flying. But here's the kicker. While everyone thought the Lexus was headed to an impound lot or maybe some empty field, I knew the real destination, Mayor Grant Ellison's front lawn. As the helicopter gained altitude, the car swayed like a bizarre suburban chandelier. Karen sprinted down the street after it, her slippers slapping the pavement, her robe flapping like a cape. She looked less like a president and more like a deranged villain in the final act of a soap opera. Neighbors doubled over with laughter. One woman shouted, "Looks like your car is finally HOA compliant, Karen. It's off the street." The crowd roared, and even the kids joined in chanting bye-bye. Lexus Karen spun around, her face red as a beet, pointing wildly at me. You'll pay for this." I raised my coffee mug in a casual salute. "Good morning, Karen." Her scream could have shattered glass. The helicopter banked, carrying the Lexus away from the cul-de-sac. Phones followed it like paparazzi chasing a celebrity meltdown. I heard snippets of disbelief all around me. Is this real life? This is better than Netflix. She's never coming back from this. And deep down, I knew they were right. Karen had wanted to humiliate me, but in the end, she had humiliated herself. The entire neighborhood had witnessed it, recorded it, and laughed at it. And soon the whole city would too. Because when that Lexus touched down on Mayor Ellison's pristine lawn during his fancy brunch with city elites, the scandal wouldn't just take down Karen. It would shake the very foundation of the cozy little empire she thought she controlled. I took one last sip of coffee, savoring the calm after the storm. The plan was in motion. Karen's empire was crumbling, and I had only just begun. By the time the helicopter and Karen's Lexus disappeared beyond the rooftops, the cul-de-sac had turned into something like a street festival. Neighbors clustered together, replaying footage on their phones, laughing so hard they could barely breathe. Jenkins wheezed until I thought he might collapse, pointing at the sky like a kid spotting Santa's sleigh. For years, Karen had walked these sidewalks with her clipboard like a crown. Now, in the span of a few minutes, her crown had been hoisted into the heavens and carried away. I went back inside my house, but I couldn't stop smiling. The first part of the plan had worked flawlessly. But the true punchline was still coming, because the helicopter wasn't headed to a tow yard or impound lot. No, its final destination was chosen with surgical precision, Mayor Grant Ellison's front lawn. Now let me explain why that mattered. Ellison wasn't just the mayor, he was Karen's shield. They were golf buddies, campaign donors, and rumor had it partners in more than one backroom deal. Every time residents complained about Karen's abuse of power, Ellison brushed it off. That's HOA business, not city business. Translation, as long as her checks cleared, he didn't care. So when I brainstormed where to drop her Lexus, there was only one place poetic enough to make her feel the humiliation she'd dished out for years. The mayor's estate was a sprawling colonial with a lawn so perfectly manicured it could have been used in a fertilizer commercial. Every Saturday morning, Ellison hosted a little brunch for his inner circle council members, donors, the local country club crowd. On that particular Saturday, the tables were already set with white linen cloths, champagne chilling in buckets, and a string quartet playing Bach under a gazebo. It was Cedar Ridge's version of high society. And into that delicate symphony of politeness, Roeder flew a roaring war machine with a chained Lexus dangling like a wrecking ball. Reports later described it in hilarious detail. The downdraft knocked champagne glasses off, tables, napkins, swirled into the air like confetti, and the string quartet scattered as if they'd rehearsed for a tornado drill. The Lexus descended, slowly chains, rattling sunlight, glinting off its hood like divine retribution. Guests screamed and scrambled, clutching their pearls and their phones in equal measure. Mayor Ellison himself stumbled out onto the grass, his face pale, his hair whipped into a frenzy by the rotor wash. "What the hell is going on?" he bellowed, just as the Lexus thudded onto his emerald green lawn, crushing a patch of grass worth more per square foot than my entire rose garden. Roeder unhooked the chains with swift efficiency, then signaled the pilot. The helicopter rose back into the sky, leaving the Lexus sitting absurdly regal in the middle of the brunch like a misplaced throne. Phones captured everything: Ellison's horrified expression, Karen's Lexus gleaming like a trophy, socialites running for cover. Within minutes, clips hit social media. One caption read, "Mayor's lawn Lexus Cedar Ridge just went Hollywood." Another simply said, "HOA Karen finally meets her match." Back in the neighborhood, we gathered in clusters, watching the footage explode across our screens. Jenkins nearly spit out his dentures laughing. "Boy," he said, wiping tears from his eyes, "you've just made history." Meanwhile, Karen was unraveling. She had chased the helicopter down the block until she collapsed, robe tangled around her legs, hair wild. Now she staggered into her house and re-emerged with her phone glued to her ear. From what I later learned, she was shrieking into the receiver, "Grant, they stole my car, they put it on your..." She choked on the last word. The mayor didn't take it well. Witnesses at the brunch said he tore into her on the phone, blaming her for the humiliation for dragging his name into her circus. It was the first crack in their alliance, and it was big enough to drive a helicopter through. By the evening, local news trucks were parked outside Ellison's estate. Anchors stood in front of the Lexus microphones, trembling in the rotor wash of replayed footage. One reporter intoned gravely, "In an unprecedented act of suburban warfare, a resident's vehicle was airlifted from a driveway and deposited on the mayor's lawn during a private brunch event." And then came the twist that had me grinning ear to ear. They revealed the owner of the vehicle, none other than HOA President Karen Kensington. Karen tried to spin it, of course. She gave a frantic interview outside her house, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "This was an act of domestic terrorism," she screeched. "A personal attack on my leadership." But the public wasn't buying it. Online comments flooded in HOA. Karen got what she deserved. Best HOA revenge story of 2025. Somebody give that man a medal. By nightfall, Mayor Ellison issued a statement condemning Karen's reckless conduct and announcing an investigation into HOA practices. He fined her personally for the damage to his lawn and hinted at further legal action. Overnight, Karen went from untouchable queen bee to national laughingstock. The next day, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer. People smiled more. Kids rode their bikes in wide circles, chanting "Mayor's lawn Lexus" like it was the chorus of a summer anthem. Even neighbors who once cowered under Karen's clipboard now waved at me with something like gratitude in their eyes. But Karen wasn't done yet. Oh no. On Monday night, she called an emergency HOA meeting. She marched in with her hair lacquered stiff, her pride patched together with tape, and her clipboard trembling in her grip. "We must restore order," she barked. "That man staged an illegal stunt against my property and our mayor." She jabbed her pen toward me. "He's a menace to this community." For the first time, the board didn't clap. They didn't nod. They just stared. Finally, one member, a woman Karen had bullied for years over the color of her mailbox, spoke up. "Karen, you parked your car across his driveway. That's illegal. You brought this on yourself." Murmurs filled the room. Karen's face flushed crimson. She sputtered excuses, but the tide had turned. That night, the board voted to strip her of the presidency. When the gavel fell, it was like a spell had been broken. The queen was dethroned. As I walked out of the meeting, Jenkins clapped me on the back. "Son, you didn't just beat her. You rewrote the whole damn playbook." And he was right. The fight wasn't just about roses anymore. It was about reminding everyone that bullies only thrive when people stay silent. And I had made sure that silence was broken in the loudest way possible by sending Karen's Lexus soaring through the skies. The Tuesday morning, after the infamous Mayor's lawn Lexus incident, Cedar Ridge felt like a different neighborhood entirely. For years, Karen's shrill voice had been the constant soundtrack of our street, her footsteps patrolling with clipboard in hand, her threats disguised as reminders. But now there was only silence. No Lexus glinting in the sun, no barking about hedge height or mailbox colors. Just laughter. Honest to God, laughter drifting across lawns like a breeze the community hadn't felt in ages. I stood by my roses, hose in hand, when Jenkins shuffled past. He tipped his cap, eyes twinkling. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said. Karen taken down by a helicopter. He chuckled so hard he nearly dropped his cane. Legendary. But while the neighborhood basked in the glow of freedom, Karen wasn't ready to surrender. That afternoon I saw her pacing on her porch, phone pressed to her ear, her voice carrying down the block. She was ranting to anyone who'd listen: lawyers, the city, probably her hairdresser, claiming she was the victim of some grand conspiracy. When she caught me watching, she snapped, "Enjoy it while you can, this isn't over." I didn't bother replying. The truth was, it was over, and deep down she knew it. Still, Karen was nothing if not stubborn. She had one last card to play: intimidation. That evening, flyers appeared on every doorstep. Bold red letters screamed, "HOA, emergency meeting, restore order to Cedar Ridge." The subtext was clear: Karen wanted her throne back. I showed up out of curiosity. The community hall was packed, every chair filled, neighbors standing along the walls, phones in hand. At the front, Karen strutted in wearing a sharp blazer, hair shellacked into a helmet, her clipboard clutched like a shield. She launched into her speech with all the fire of a general rallying troops. "This community is in chaos," she barked. One resident staged a dangerous stunt, an act of domestic terrorism. He endangered lives, embarrassed our mayor, and disrespected the very rules that hold Cedar Ridge together. Her voice cracked as she jabbed her pen at me. "He must be punished." For a moment the room was silent. Then slowly, someone from the back spoke. "Karen, you parked your car across his driveway." The words rippled through the room like a stone tossed into a pond. Heads nodded. Murmurs rose. Another neighbor added, "That's trespassing." Karen's face flushed red. She stammered, that was lawful immobilization. "No," came another voice, firm this time. It was Linda, a quiet woman Karen had once fined for having a garden gnome not in compliance. She stood up, her voice trembling but steady. "You abused your power. You humiliated people. And now you've humiliated all of us." Applause broke out. Karen's eyes widened in shock, her mouth working soundlessly as the room turned against her. The board members, once her loyal puppets, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, one of them cleared his throat. "All in favor of removing Karen Kensington as HOA president." Hands shot up, nearly unanimous. Karen's clipboard slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. For a woman who had ruled through fear, the sound was louder than any gavel. She was dethroned, stripped of her title, in the very meeting hall where she'd once reigned supreme. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The look on her face, equal parts disbelief and humiliation, was victory enough. But the fallout was just beginning. The very next day, Mayor Ellison held a press conference. He stood stiffly at a podium, flanked by city council members, sweat beading on his forehead. Effective immediately, he announced the city will be reviewing all HOA enforcement practices. Contracts with towing companies will be reevaluated, and violations of property rights will no longer be tolerated. Translation: Karen's empire had collapsed, and he was scrambling to save face. He even fined her personally for the damage to his lawn, tens of thousands of dollars for restoration of city property. To add salt to the wound, local news stations replayed the helicopter footage on loop, meme after meme spreading across the internet. My personal favorite was one with the caption, "Karen wanted power. She got horsepower." By Thursday, the national outlets picked it up. Talk shows debated it. Late-night comedians joked about it. One host quipped, "When your HOA gets too powerful, sometimes you've just got to call in air support." The audience roared with laughter. Karen became infamous overnight, her name synonymous with petty tyranny gone wrong. She tried to hold her head high, strutting to the mailbox in oversized sunglasses, but the whispers followed her everywhere. Kids on bikes sang Mayor's Lawn Lexus, like it was a nursery rhyme. Parents waved at me with a mix of respect and relief, as though I'd slain the dragon they'd all been too afraid to face. Still, I knew better than to underestimate Karen's resilience. She called another lawyer, tried to file charges against me. But when she presented her case, complete with shaky claims of terrorism, the attorney laughed her out of the office. "You parked your car across his garage," he told her bluntly. "He had every right to remove it." Case closed. For once, Karen had no comeback. The final nail in the coffin came a week later when the HOA board, under new leadership, voted to refund years of unjust fines. Families who'd been bullied over mailbox colors and garden decorations received apologies. A new grievance process was put in place, one that actually respected residents' rights. Cedar Ridge began to heal. As for Karen, she lasted another month skulking around in her tracksuits, glaring at anyone who dared smile in her direction. Eventually, the for sale sign appeared in her yard. Word spread that she was moving to Florida starting fresh. Neighbors gathered quietly on their porches the morning the moving truck rolled away. No one waved goodbye. No one shed a tear. If anything, the air seemed lighter, freer. Birds sang louder. Kids laughed harder. And me, I sat on my porch, bourbon in hand, watching the last of her empire drive off into the distance. I didn't feel triumph so much as peace. For the first time in years, I could tend my roses without a clipboard shadow looming over me. But more than that, I realized something important. Bullies only win when good people stay silent. Karen mistook silence for power. She thought fear was loyalty. But the moment the community found its voice loud, defiant, and airborne, her illusion crumbled. As Jenkins liked to say, sometimes you've got to fight fire with fire, or in this case, ego with altitude. And in Cedar Ridge, altitude had won. I'll never forget the look on Karen's face the day the for sale sign finally appeared in her yard. It was as if her entire kingdom had been reduced to a splintered clipboard and a pile of unpaid citations. She tried to hold herself with the same stiff posture she'd once used to lord over the cul-de-sac, but even from across the street I could see the cracks. Her shoulders sagged, her eyes darted nervously at neighbors who now stared openly, some even smirking. Cedar Ridge had changed. The very people she used to intimidate now walked past her house with a newfound swagger. Kids who once avoided her gaze now chalked giant roses on the sidewalk in front of her lawn, their laughter echoing down the block. Even Linda, the garden gnome lady, started planting wildflowers in her yard without fear of a non-compliance notice being slipped into her mailbox. But the real shift wasn't just in our neighborhood, it spread far beyond. Social media had turned Karen into an unwilling celebrity. Clips of the helicopter lifting her Lexus went viral, rebranded with hashtags like #HOA Karen, #Mayor Lawn Drop, and #Heli Justice. One edit set the footage to Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. Another slowed it down in cinematic style, complete with dramatic narration, and thus the reign of Karen came to a crashing end. My nephew showed me one, where someone photoshopped her Lexus into the opening scene of The Lion King dangling over Pride Rock. Karen hated it. Every time she stepped outside, she wore oversized sunglasses, as if hiding from paparazzi. But there was no hiding. Even people in the next town recognized her now. One local cafe had a drink special called the Flying Lexus, a latte topped with foam shaped like helicopter blades. Her grip on the HOA had been completely severed. The board, now free of her iron fist, voted through sweeping changes. Rules about hedge height, mailbox color, and approved garden ornaments were struck down in a single meeting. For the first time in years, people actually laughed at an HOA gathering. Jenkins even brought cupcakes. Still, Karen wasn't finished fighting. She filed complaints with the city, claiming she'd been the victim of theft and harassment. She stormed into City Hall, demanding to see Mayor Ellison, only to be told he wasn't available. Later, I heard from a council member that the mayor wanted nothing to do with her. In fact, he'd privately referred to her as a political liability. Coming from a man who had once happily golfed with her every Saturday, that was devastating. The lawsuits she threatened never materialized. Every attorney she approached turned her away. One even told her, "Ma'am, parking across a homeowner's driveway is trespassing. You dug this hole yourself." She left his office, red-faced, muttering about corruption. As weeks passed, the for sale sign in her yard grew more weathered, the bright red letters fading under the sunday. Prospective buyers came and went, but none made offers. Who would want to buy the most infamous house in Cedar Ridge? It wasn't just a home anymore, it was a landmark of humiliation. Kids pointed at it on bike rides, parents whispered. That's where it all started, like it was a haunted mansion. Then came the day of the moving truck. It pulled up early on a Saturday, a gray, overcast sky hanging over the neighborhood like a curtain closing on a bad play. Karen scurried back and forth, barking at the movers, her voice sharp but hollow. No one came to help. No casseroles, no polite goodbyes, not even a forced smile. Instead, neighbors stood on their porches, arms folded, sipping coffee, watching. When the last box was loaded, Karen paused on her porch as if expecting anyone to stop her, to beg her to stay. No one did. The silence was suffocating. Finally, she climbed into her car, the same Lexus now returned and scratched from the ordeal, and drove off without looking back. The moment the truck disappeared, a cheer went up from Jenkins's porch. He raised his mug high and shouted, "Freedom at last!" Laughter followed. Kids clapped. Even the dogs barked as if joining the celebration. The mood was electric, like the first day of summer after a long winter. That evening I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon staring at the empty driveway across the street. For years, that spot had been the staging ground of her tyranny, where she measured grass, handed out fines, and plotted her next petty crusade. Now it was just an empty slab of concrete. And for the first time, Cedar Ridge felt like ours again. But as I sipped my drink, a thought settled in this story wasn't just about Karen. It was about what happens when people let bullies run unchecked. She'd built her power on fear, counting on silence. But once that silence broke, once people laughed instead of cowered, her empire crumbled faster than I could have imagined. The helicopter hadn't just lifted her Lexus. It had lifted the weight she'd put on all of us. And in its place, we found something stronger than rules or fines: community. Later that night, Jenkins knocked on my door. He handed me a folded piece of paper with shaky handwriting scrawled across it. "Son," he said, "I wrote this down because I didn't want to forget. Sometimes you fight fire with fire. Sometimes you fight ego with altitude." He winked, his eyes gleaming. "And you, my boy, fought with altitude." I laughed, tucking the note into my pocket. He wasn't wrong. Karen was gone, the HOA was reborn, and Cedar Ridge was free. For the first time in years, I could breathe easy among my roses, knowing no clipboard would come knocking. But most importantly, I knew this Karen hadn't just lost her Lexus or her title. She had lost the one thing bullies crave most: fear, and without it, she was nothing more than a story. The dust from Karen's exit hadn't fully settled when Cedar Ridge entered what I like to call its rebuilding season. For years, our community had been micromanaged to death, every hedge trimmed to a regulation height, every garage door repainted at the slightest scratch, every child's chalk drawing labeled graffiti. Without Karen's iron grip, the HOA was suddenly free. At first, people didn't quite know what to do with themselves. For so long, they'd lived under her endless scrutiny that the idea of choice felt foreign. Should they plant new flowers without approval? Could they leave a lawn chair out overnight without fearing a citation? I remember Mrs. Donnelly staring at her front yard like it was a foreign country. She wasn't sure she had the passport to enter. The first board meeting after Karen's ouster set the tone. Linda, our newly elected president, the same Linda who once stood trembling before Karen over a non-compliant gnome, sat at the head of the table. Instead of wielding a clipboard like a weapon, she brought cookies. Real homemade cookies. She opened the meeting with a simple sentence: "This HOA should work for you, not against you." The room erupted in applause, a sound none of us had ever heard in that hall. We spent the next 2 hours dismantling Karen's empire piece by piece. The ridiculous uniform hedge height bylaw gone. The mandate that everyone repaint their shutters every 3 years regardless of condition, struck down. The infamous no outdoor toys left unattended rule obliterated. Parents clapped so loudly at that one you'd think they'd won the lottery. But the most symbolic vote came when someone suggested lifting the ban on personal garden decorations. It passed unanimously, and the very next morning Cedar Ridge bloomed. Flamingos popped up in front yards, wind chimes jingled on porches. Even a 10-foot inflatable flamingo appeared on the Petersons' lawn just to prove a point. And every time I passed Linda's yard, her garden gnome sat proudly by the walkway, a tiny ceramic middle finger to Karen's reign. Of course, the outside world hadn't forgotten us. News vans still prowled occasionally, hoping to snag a soundbite. Social media accounts dedicated to HOA fails kept replaying the helicopter video, sometimes edited with commentary or dramatic music. A local brewery even released a seasonal IPA called Liftoff Lexus. Its label showed a cartoon SUV dangling from chains under a helicopter, foam spilling from the top like rotor wash. Jenkins bought a 6-pack and declared it the taste of freedom. Meanwhile, Karen tried to claw back relevance. Rumors spread that she'd filed complaints with the county and even tried to launch a new HOA in her new neighborhood down in Florida. The internet mocked her mercilessly. One meme showed her standing in front of a cul-de-sac with the caption "Karen HOA Speedrun Level 2. Another claimed she'd applied for a job as a traffic warden, but here in Cedar Ridge, we'd moved on. One night, about a month after she left, Jenkins invited me over for a bourbon. He leaned back in his rocking chair, the porch light casting shadows across his weathered face. "Son," he said, "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. I thought I'd die under that woman's thumb. Never figured it'd take a helicopter to set us free." He chuckled, then added more seriously, "But you taught us something. You showed us we didn't have to just take it." I sipped my drink, letting his words settle. He was right, but I couldn't shake the thought that it wasn't just me. The whole neighborhood had played a part even if they didn't realize it. Every camera raised, every cheer shouted, every laugh shared, had chipped away at Karen's power. I might have set the plan in motion, but the community had carried it to victory. Still, not everything was rosy. For weeks, I half expected retaliation. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. I checked my mail for suspicious letters, watched for strange cars idling near my house, but nothing came. The only trace of her left was the occasional meme and the memory of her shriek as her Lexus lifted into the sky. The biggest surprise came from Mayor Ellison. Desperate to salvage his reputation after being dragged into the scandal, he launched a community partnership initiative. Suddenly, the city was very interested in oversight of HOA practices. He even visited Cedar Ridge, personally shaking hands and promising reforms. Most of us saw it for what it was: damage control. Still, it was satisfying to watch him squirm, forced to smile for the very people he'd ignored when Karen ran wild. At one point during his visit, a neighbor whispered to me, "Bet he still has nightmares about that Lexus crushing his lawn." I grinned. So did half the county. The climax of our rebuilding came at the annual block party. For years, Karen had canceled it, citing safety concerns and noise ordinances. But this time, with Linda's blessing, we threw the biggest bash Cedar Ridge had ever seen. Food trucks lined the street, kids zipped around on scooters, a local band played from Jenkins's driveway. At sunset, someone projected the viral helicopter video onto a bedsheet strung between two trees. The crowd roared with laughter, reliving the moment together as one. Standing there, surrounded by my neighbors, I realized something profound. Karen had tried to use shame as a weapon to make me an example of what happens when you defy the HOA. Instead, she became the example herself. Her arrogance had united the neighborhood in a way nothing else could have. She'd forged a community out of shared resistance, and in the end, her downfall was our liberation. As the party wound down, Jenkins raised his glass in a toast. To freedom, to neighbors, and to altitude. The cheer that followed shook the cul-de-sac louder than any clipboard ever could. And for the first time since Karen moved in, I felt truly at home. The morning after the block party, Cedar Ridge felt lighter than I'd ever known it. The air itself seemed freer, as if the laughter of neighbors had blown away the last cobwebs of Karen's rule. Children darted down the street with chalk in hand, drawing everything from rockets to roses across the asphalt. Dogs ran untethered in wide circles, while their owners sipped coffee on porches, unconcerned about citations for unleashed pets. For the first time in years, it felt like we weren't living under surveillance. But freedom, I realized, isn't just about the absence of tyranny, it's about what you do with it once you have it. And Cedar Ridge was learning how to live again. Linda, now HOA president, called another meeting in the community hall. This time, the chairs filled not with dread but with anticipation. She opened with a smile, no clipboard, no ruler, no barking orders. "We're not here to control one another," she said. "We're here to protect what we love about this neighborhood." The applause that followed was genuine, not the forced claps Karen once demanded. People began suggesting ideas instead of fearing fines. A community garden where the empty lot had stood neglected for years. A neighborhood watch focused not on violations but on safety. Even a monthly movie night projected onto a garage door. The HOA charter, once a book of punishments, was slowly being rewritten into something else, a guide for cooperation. I sat in the back of that meeting watching neighbors who once whispered now speak with confidence. Jenkins raised his hand and proposed, "We enshrine a new bylaw. No single resident shall have unchecked authority to fine or punish others." The motion passed unanimously, and I swear I could feel Karen's ghost screaming from wherever she'd fled. Her shadow still loomed, of course. News outlets occasionally resurfaced the viral footage sometimes, with dramatic headlines like "The Day a Lexus Flew" or "HOA Justice Takes Flight." National talk shows debated whether my stunt was heroic or reckless. One radio caller even suggested I run for local office. I laughed at the idea, but deep down I recognized the irony. Karen had tried to strip me of power, and instead she'd handed me a kind of influence I never wanted. Still, I never saw it as revenge. Not really. Revenge is about destruction. What I'd done was about exposure. Karen had hidden behind rules and bureaucracy, making her abuses seem legitimate. But when her arrogance went airborne, when the entire city watched her Lexus dangle from a helicopter, her illusion shattered. People saw her not as a leader, but as what she really was, a bully with a clipboard. In the weeks that followed, neighbors shared stories I'd never heard before. Linda confessed that Karen once threatened to fine her for putting up Christmas lights too early. The Petersons admitted she'd humiliated their teenage son at a board meeting for leaving his skateboard on the lawn. Even Jenkins, tough as he was, revealed she'd once slapped him with a violation for having tomatoes visible from the street. Each confession carried the same undertone shame. Karen had made people feel small guilty for simply living. And yet the moment she fell, their shame turned to laughter. It was as if we'd all woken from the same bad dream at once. What struck me most was how quickly community bonds healed once fear was gone. Neighbors who'd barely spoken to each other now traded recipes, tools, even childcare. The block party became a monthly tradition. I lost count of how many times Jenkins raised his glass in a toast to altitude, his favorite word for what had happened. Cedar Ridge wasn't just surviving without Karen, it was thriving. But I also knew the story wasn't just ours anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever suffered under small-time tyrants, whether in HOAs, offices, or even families. Emails poured into my inbox from strangers across the country. One man wrote, "I wish I'd had the courage to stand up to my HOA like you did." A woman confessed her boss had bullied her for years, and the video of Karen's Lexus had given her the courage to quit. That's when it hit me, this was bigger than Cedar Ridge. It was about the universal truth that bullies thrive on silence. And silence, once broken, becomes contagious. Of course, Karen herself never apologized. Rumors swirled that she'd moved to Florida, tried to start fresh, maybe even attempted to run another HOA. If that's true, I pity her new neighbors. But for us, she became nothing more than a punchline. Kids still chant Mayor's Lawn Lexus during bike races, and sometimes when a helicopter passes overhead, the whole block bursts out laughing. One evening, I stood in my yard, pruning the roses Karen once despised. Their petals glowed red in the sunset, more vibrant than ever. I thought about my late wife who had planted them years ago, and how Karen had tried to erase that memory with her rules. The roses had survived her. So had we. Jenkins wandered over, sipping from his ever-present mug. Funny thing he said. "When she was here, I thought the best we could hope for was peace. But now we've got joy. And that's worth more than any rule book." He was right. Peace is the absence of conflict. Joy is the presence of freedom. And Cedar Ridge, for the first time in years, had joy. So what's the lesson? It's not that helicopters solve everything, though I'll admit, altitude makes for good theater. The real lesson is simpler. Don't let small tyrants convince you their rules are law. Stand tall, laugh loudly, fight back with creativity, and never forget that bullies crumble fastest under the weight of their own arrogance. Karen thought she was invincible. She thought fear was loyalty. But fear can vanish in an instant, replaced by courage, and sometimes by the roar of rotor blades. And in that moment, when her Lexus lifted from my driveway, she didn't just lose a car. She lost the one thing she needed most control. That's the story I'll tell my grandchildren someday. Not about roses or rules, but about the morning a community remembered who it was. About how silence was broken, laughter returned, and freedom soared. What happened in Cedar Ridge taught me one lesson I'll carry for the rest of my life. Bullies thrive only when people stay silent. Karen built her power on fear, fine slips, threats, and a clipboard she wielded like a crown. For years, neighbors whispered instead of speaking up, and that silence gave her control. But the moment we stood together, laughed at her arrogance, and exposed her cruelty, her empire collapsed. The truth is, standing up to someone doesn't always require confrontation or anger. Sometimes it takes creativity, courage, and just enough humor to show the world how absurd their tyranny really island. A helicopter and a Lexus might have made headlines, but the real victory was the community reclaiming its voice. So if you're facing a Karen in your life, whether it's an HOA tyrant, an overbearing boss, or anyone who feeds on intimidation, remember this: their power is fragile. The moment you stop fearing them, they've already lost. Tell me in the comments, what's the worst HOA or neighborhood story you've lived through? And don't forget to subscribe. There are plenty more tales of justice, karma, and HOA drama to come.